This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Isle of the Dancing Dead, written by Rick Kennett, narrated by Chris Herron. "Is it true," said young George as he filled his first grave, "that the best place to hide from a ghost is in a cemetery?" "Yes," said the gravedigger, shoveling. "Most times you'd be right to hold into that notion, but not here. Not in this particular cemetery. Not with the Chenoweth Grand Tomb not 500 yards behind you." "A haunted grave?" George turned about, studying the lawns and masonry. "Which one?" "You've not seen it yet?" "Fair go, Monty. I've only been on the job 6 hours." "Well, you'll know the Grand Tomb when you see it," he chuckled. "Or, if you're Chenoweth, when you hear it." "How's that?" "Later, lad. One grave at a time." When they'd finished and patted down the earth, Monty conducted George through a maze of headstones to the center of the cemetery, where the young gravedigger suddenly found himself at the edge of a small lake. In the middle of this lake was an island, and in the middle of the island was a squat, black marble building. "The Chenoweth Grand Tomb," said Monty proudly. 150 years old and the grandest mausoleum in the southern hemisphere. And its maintenance and its keeping of its doors are my responsibility alone." "Haunted?" asked George. "Haunted by the Wailing Woman. There's been times in the past 8 years that its coffins have been found all danced about higgledy-piggledy when it's opened to put in another Chenoweth to rest. But, as they say, there's no rest for the wicked, and the Chenoweth Grand Tomb is proving it. 100 years ago, some Chenoweth massacred some aborigines camped on their land. What with the Chenoweths being rich squatters, nothing ever came of it. Not as far as white man's law was concerned, anyway, because it is said that the family was cursed by a Koroji man, a sort of witch doctor. And ever since then, the murderers and the descendants have danced in death to the crying of the Wailing Woman." "Have you ever heard this Wailing Woman?" "No, she can't be heard by any but Chenoweth about to die, and those already dead." "Why's there a lake?" "It's a defense. It was dug 90 years ago in the belief that spirits can't cross water, and that a defense is more convenient and dignified than shifting all the dearly departed." "Does it work?" "Yes, most times. I remember 5 years ago, a summer that burnt the lake to little better than mud, and that's when I last saw the Grand Tomb opened." "And the coffins?" Monty smiled. "What do you think?" George thought, and over the next few days, asked other workmates about the tomb, discovering little that Monty hadn't already told him, other than, when the occasion arose, the island could be reached by a pontoon bridge stored in a special shed. Unfortunately for George's curiosity, maintenance of the island's lawn and garden was a once-a-year job, and unauthorized entry onto the lake and island was strictly forbidden. George had to make do with standing on the lake's edge during lunch hour, staring out at the black tomb on the island, thinking. A few months later, millionaire W. Chenoweth Sr. became critically ill. Like discreet vultures, the cemetery management hovered in anticipation, assigning Monty the task of grooming the island. Permitted to choose his own assistant, he chose George. George pressed his ear to the black marble wall and heard a voice say, "Take your partners for the dance macabre." He spun around, coming face to grinning face with Monty. Embarrassed, the youngster went back to his weeding. 5 years they've had to jig," said Monty with a chuckle. "Do you think they'll pick today?" George poked around at the dirt with his weeding tool. "That's not what I was listening for." "So what were you listening for?" "Water." "Oh, yes." "No, Monty, I'm serious. I've been thinking over this dancing coffin caper, and I reckon the Chenoweths are causing this so-called curse to come true themselves." "Themselves?" Before I dropped out of uni, I was doing a course in hydrodynamics. The tomb is airtight, right? It also has its foundations below the water level of the lake." He indicated the 3 stone steps leading down to the door of the tomb. "What if hot weather was to affect the air pressure inside, causing the lake water to seep in and flood the tomb? It would float the coffins about, then when the weather changes, the water disappears, the coffins settle higgledy-piggledy, and there's your dancing dead." "Well, firstly, lad, the floor of the tomb is tiles. Tiles crack, tiles break. Secondly, the Chenoweth coffins are lead-lined, too heavy to float about. If the coffins are airtight, they'd be buoyant. Steel ships float, you know. And pigs may fly. Let me tell you again what I've seen. That's seen. Them coffins danced about, upside down, against the walls, laying atop each other. There's nothing natural about this particular grave." "Wouldn't you like to be sure?" "How do you mean?" "I mean, have some method to see if I'm right or wrong." "How?" "With a glass jar." "A what?" "We leave an empty glass jar, weighted with lead in it so it won't float, in the tomb next time it's opened. Then, if I'm right, the next time the coffins are found dancing about, our jar will be full of water." Monty nodded. "There's something in it, I admit. But what do you mean exactly by we?" "You're the one responsible for opening and closing the tomb. A little sleight of hand before you lock the doors after the next funeral. And when the tomb is opened again, we may have our evidence, one way or the other. Haven't you ever wondered what really goes on inside this tomb, way down deep in the dark? In the next few days, we may have our only opportunity to discover the truth of the curse of the Wailing Woman once and for all. What do you say?" "I don't think it's a good idea. It's tampering with the unknown." "All we'd be tampering with is the tomb's phony reputation." "Young George, there's nothing phony about the Chenoweth Grand Tomb." "Then prove me wrong." "With a glass jar, a lump of lead, and a little sleight of hand." Next morning, the news broke that W. Chenoweth had died during the night. The day before the funeral, Monty opened the tomb in the presence of the cemetery manager, who, with an air of businesslike solemnity, stepped into its shadows. When he re-emerged, his expression was one that belied any belief in curses or rumors of curses. "Very good, Mr. Montague. Carry on." Duly checked, the mausoleum was closed for a further 24 hours. On the morning of the funeral, George handed Monty a glass jar coiled about with the thickness of lead. An hour later, when he reopened the tomb, Monty secreted the jar in the back corner beneath the rearmost bier. That afternoon, as the last mourners left the island, he closed and locked the doors. All he and George could do now was wait for hot days and low water. They got them 2 years later in a summer full of hot days. Despite a connection to a nearby lake, the lake level dropped. George could almost see it falling day by day. He grew restless and impatient to the extent of having vague fantasies of waylaying a Chenoweth just to get the tomb open. The lake was little more than mud when the late autumn rains finally broke the dry. But by then, George had left the cemetery to have another crack at university. Many months passed before George laid eyes on the Chenoweth Grand Tomb again. It was a sunny afternoon, and he decided to skip a class to visit Monty. He found him gardening by the lake. Almost immediately, their conversation turned to the tomb. George expressed disappointment that the tomb hadn't been opened since he'd left the cemetery. Monty smiled with mock agreement. "Yes, it's been irritating how none of the Chenoweths have had the common courtesy to drop dead yet." "Why wait?" said George. "Why what?" Monty's smile disappeared. "Why wait for a Chenoweth to die? Why not take a look ourselves?" "Now?" "Tonight. The water's what? Knee-deep? Easy waiting." Monty shook his head. "It'd be my job.
It's not worth the risk."
"Then lend me the keys. They can't sack me."
"The keys will not be leaving my keeping. It was a stupid thing I did, putting that jar in there."
"The only stupid thing you did was failing to see that the dancing dead are caused by a series of circumstances all very natural in origin."
"There's nothing natural about the Chenoweth Grand Tomb, lad. It's what I've always said, and it's what I believe."
George pointed to the tomb on the island.
"Proof of what you say is there right now, Monty. The lake went dry last summer, plenty of time for low pressure within the tomb to suck up water, plenty of opportunity for your wailing woman to cross and call the next dance. Whether I'm right, whether you're right, the coffins must have been disturbed by now. The drying up of the lake is the common factor. But if you want to wait for a Chenoweth to die before you'll take a look inside the tomb, then you may be waiting a long time. In fact, you may be dead yourself before—"
"All right." Monty looked across the lake.
"All right, we'll go tonight. But if the coffins have not been disturbed, then I'm waiting for the proper time."
George nodded. Agreed. The mud oozed between their toes, and the midnight water was cold about their knees. They climbed onto the island and padded across the lawn to the tomb. Monty unlocked the tomb door.
"The torch, lad."
George handed it over. Monty pushed the door until it opened wide enough to admit half a face. He flicked the torch beam around inside, and what he saw in fragments. A bit of wall, a dried wreath, the glint from a glass jar. He pushed again. He stopped.
"Go on, Monty. Open it,"
George said nervously.
"I can't. There's a coffin jammed against it."
George peered around the edge of the door and saw that it was true. A coffin was jammed edgewise in the entrance. Others were strewn about the tomb in total disarray. It took several minutes of steady pushing to open the door wide enough to permit George to slither through. He took the torch and made his way over and around the scattered Chenoweth coffins, trying not to look behind him, his eyes fixed ahead on the beckoning glint of glass. At the rearmost bier, he stopped and plucked the jar from its corner. He didn't dare look at its contents. Should it be dry, he knew he could not long vouch for his reason there among the dancing dead. Back at the door, he handed Monty the jar, then squeezed through. Monty held the jar up to the torchlight, and they saw. After a moment, George said, "I'm sorry, Monty." The gravedigger shrugged. He produced a lid from his coat pocket and screwed it down on the jar of water.
"Well, maybe the Chenoweths will reward us if we can show that the Wailing Woman is just a tomb full of cold water. Perhaps you could take the water to your university labs and get it checked. You never know. It might come from a different source than the lake. An underground stream, perhaps. Or perhaps it's only condensation."
Monty's eyes glistened in the torchlight.
"You never know,"
he repeated softly. "I'll get it checked," George promised. Monty met George a week later, standing in his usual spot at the edge of the lake, staring out at the black marble tomb on the island.
"Did you get the water checked, lad?"
"Yes," said George, still staring outwards. "In fact, I've just come from the lab."
"What's the matter? You're not acting like the one who's proved there's no such thing as the Wailing Woman."
"I wouldn't say that, Monty. It wasn't just water in the jar." George finally turned around. It was tears. Rick Kennett has 5 books on Amazon, 2 novels, The Devil in the Deep Blue Sea and Presumed Dead, a novella, In Quinn's Paddock, and 2 collections, The Dark and What It Said and 30 Minutes for New Hell. He also recently published a new anthology, War of the Worlds, Battleground Australia. In addition, you can check out his story, Presumed Dead, serialized by the podcast Cast of Wonders, which is free to listen on their website. Links in the description. On a side note, Isle of the Dancing Dead is based on the Chase Vault mystery, and is Rick Kennett's most published story. Hey guys, I think this is one of my favorite stories Rick has submitted over the past few years. What do you think? If you did enjoy it, be sure to check out the plethora of other stories on the channel by him. I'll leave a link in the description to where you can find them all in one spot. And, of course, be sure to subscribe. This show is available on YouTube, Facebook, and just about every podcast platform out there. I'm Chris Herron, and that's it for today's Tall Tale TV.